And as folks continue to sign on, I wanted to welcome everyone to today's webinar hosted by the National Safe and Healthy Housing Coalition, the National Center for Healthy Housing, the Environmental Defense Fund, and the Silent Spring Institute. Today, we are really excited to be providing a general introduction to the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, with a particular emphasis on the core part of TSCA, Title I. We know that some of you may be joining this webinar and maybe you don't know anything about TSCA at all. That's okay, you're in the right place. And some of you may be joining and be most familiar with TSCA through its connection to lead-based paint activities regulated under Title IV. To be clear, today's conversation absolutely connects to all of that experience, whether you've heard of TSCA or not, or only know about it through its lead-based paint activities or not. It connects to the homes already affected by lead and other healthy housing hazards, as well as the interventions we use in those home environments to address those kinds of hazards. But rather than focusing specifically on the lead provisions of TSCA, today's webinar is intended to broaden the conversation to other parts of the law, particularly Title I, and the role that chemical policy plays in shaping healthier indoor environments overall. As all of you know, healthy housing has traditionally focused pretty heavily on the physical condition of homes and buildings, which remains critically important. We also all know that part of creating healthier homes is making sure that we're not unintentionally trading one hazard for another. And over time, I think the field has gotten better at recognizing the importance of thinking carefully about the products, materials, and chemicals that are already present inside of homes, as well as those introduced by the occupants themselves or through the housing interventions that we're providing. For example, many of us in the field remember going through the shift many years ago towards integrated pest management approaches after recognizing that simply replacing pests like cockroaches and mice with increased pesticide exposure was not actually really necessarily improving net health outcomes. In a similar way, today's conversations around TSCA connect to concerns about a wider range of exposures than we may be used to talking about in our field, or things that sometimes get swept up into broader umbrella terms like indoor air quality or environmental quality, things like volatile organic compounds, phthalates, flame retardants, PFAS, formaldehyde, and other chemicals that are commonly found in building materials, furnishings, and consumer products. And so I just want to acknowledge upfront that while we recognize there may be a deep interest in a deeper discussion related to TSCA and lead amongst many of the friends and familiar faces that we see joining today's conversation, we're going to ask that if you have questions or ideas related specifically to the lead provisions of TSCA, that we encourage you to share those with the hosts, any of the hosting organizations after today's session, so that we can better understand interest in future conversations focused specifically on lead. For today, our focus is going to be a little bit different, and we hope that this webinar will start as a useful starting point for many of you joining who just want to better understand how federal chemical policy intersects with housing, public health, and indoor environmental quality. We hope it's just a starting point and that it will encourage and continued learning and conversation about how these concepts may inform our collective and individual practice, even outside of formal regulatory contexts. It's also worth emphasizing that today's webinar is intended just to be educational and informational. Our goal is to provide that context about TSCA and how it relates to healthy housing and indoor environments and why these conversations are increasingly relevant to our field. We recognize that organizations and different individual attendees may bring different perspectives and priorities to these issues, and just want to acknowledge upfront that participation in today's session by panelists or by any of you joining, by your participation in the chat, should not be interpreted as endorsement of any particular policy position or advocacy priority or activity. People are here to learn, and we encourage you to join in the conversation in that spirit. Our agenda for today is that we're first going to hear from our colleagues at EDF, who are going to provide an overview of TSCA, just give us that grounding in what it is and why it's important, followed by our friends at Silent Spring, who's going to put that information into context for us and help us understand how prevalent these types of chemicals are in the current homes that we're already working in, and why we really can't afford to just continue to rely on individual behavior changes alone. Then we're going to hear from EDF again about the current and future outlook for TSCA before turning to a discussion with all of our panelists. And with that discussion in mind, we encourage you throughout the presentations to enter any questions that you may have that occur to you into the chat. We'll be seeing them and logging them as we go through so that we can get to as many as possible during the discussion time following our presentations. And with that, I am very pleased to introduce Lindsay McCormick, Senior Program Manager of Safer Chemicals at the Environmental Defense Fund, who will help ground us in what TSCA is, why it matters, and why these conversations are increasingly relevant to the field of healthy housing. Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lindsay McCormick with Environmental Defense Fund, and I'm really excited to be here today to talk about TSCA, or the Toxic Substances Control Act. Today, Congress is debating changes to TSCA, which my colleague Suhani is going to be discussing in more detail towards the end of the webinar. But before we get there, I want to spend a few minutes talking about the history of TSCA, why it's an important law to help keep our homes and families safe. You go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the primary purpose of TSCA is to protect public health and the environment from toxic chemicals by preventing what are called unreasonable risks to human health and the environment. It's an incredibly broad statute, including consumer, commercial, and industrial chemicals and exposure scenarios, and regulating the entire life cycle of chemicals from their manufacture, processing, and transport, all the way to consumer and commercial uses and their disposal. Within this, TSCA covers almost any chemical in our material world, with the most common exceptions being pesticides, which are covered under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA, as commonly known, as well as food, drugs, and cosmetics or personal care products, which fall under FDA's jurisdiction under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. So on the right side of this slide, you can see some of the everyday examples of chemicals that do fall under TSCA's jurisdiction, from those used in household cleaning products and furniture to construction materials like paint, adhesives, and spray foams. And as Amanda mentioned, TSCA does have 6 titles, including a number that are very important to healthy housing. But today we're going to focus on Title I, where much of the current legislative debate is occurring. Next slide, please. So within TSCA Title I, there are a number of major components, which I'll focus on 4, which are really the primary ones. So first, TSCA Section 5 regulates new chemicals coming to market, and this means that any chemical that has not been introduced in the U.S. commerce must be submitted for pre-market review by the manufacturer to EPA, which then has the ability to decide whether or not its production can commence, and if so, whether any restrictions or parameters need to be put in place, such as chemical testing, workplace protection standards, or restricted water releases. The other really big section of TSCA is TSCA Section 6, which addresses chemicals already existing on the market and in everyday use. And this part of TSCA gives EPA the mandate to assess these chemicals, starting with those with the highest risk profile or potential for risk, and assessing whether there is, in fact, an unreasonable risk. Where found, EPA must eliminate that unreasonable risk through regulatory actions such as bans, restrictions, or workplace protection programs. Then TSCA Section 4 gives EPA the authority to require companies to conduct testing on chemicals, such as information on health effects or exposure to consumers. And TSCA Section 8 gives EPA the authority to require companies to report existing information, such as how a chemical is being used or any data available on its toxicity that's already something that they have in hand. Next slide, please. All right, so now I'm gonna I'm gonna go back in time a little bit, and I'm realizing that there is a typo on this slide. TSCA history should actually say pre-2016, so I apologize for that. So TSCA was first established in 1976, and for many years, the law was really hamstrung. It did not provide EPA with the legal teeth to effectively manage chemicals. And just to name a few examples here, under the new chemicals program, unless EPA could make the case that a new chemical was harmful, even if it didn't have the appropriate information to make that, reasoned decision, the chemical would automatically go to market after 90 days. So we often refer to this as like the 90-day shot clock. Existing chemicals really just weren't addressed at all. So in 1990, EPA tried, and after a lawsuit failed to ban asbestos, this is sort of the poster child of the failure of TSCA. The court's interpretation of the original law required to select the quote the least burdensome regulatory approach, squashed EPA's ability to regulate existing chemicals on the market moving forward. So, and then one other major challenge to the original statute was that EPA rarely required chemicals already on the market to be tested due to a catch-22 in the original law, where EPA essentially had to demonstrate that a chemical was toxic before it had any information to do so. All right, next slide, please. So fast forward, after 40 years of an ineffective law and many, many years of negotiation, in 2016, Congress passed a sweeping reform of TSCA with bipartisan support, giving EPA the tools it needs to evaluate and manage chemicals. It passed the time with near unanimous support from both Democrats and Republicans, showing that it is was strongly supported in a bipartisan fashion. Today, the law is much more effective. It requires EPA to make an affirmative safety determination on a new chemical before it can go to market, and no data, no problem is no longer allowed. EPA now has a mandate to look back at existing chemicals and mitigate that identified risk, and it replaces EPA's burdensome cost-benefit safety standard, which prevented the banning of asbestos, with a purely health-based standard. Now, EPA also has the authority to require testing under both the new and existing sections of TSCA using a quicker method than the cumbersome rulemaking required by the original law. And there's a lot of other really important changes, but one more that I will flag is that EPA is required to assess and address potentially, the quote is potentially exposed or susceptible subpopulations, which is kind of wonky terminology, to look at those most vulnerable in our society. So this includes, but is not limited to, pregnant women, children, and workers. Next slide, please. So the law did take some time to get off the ground, including due to some setbacks under the first Trump administration. But during the Biden administration, EPA made quite a bit of progress under TSCA. So I'm just going to talk about a few of those briefly here. Under the existing chemicals program, EPA banned or restricted some of the most toxic chemicals in use, including methylene chloride, which has caused dozens of fatalities due to its use as a paint stripper, including the son of Wendy Hartley, who's a woman who we worked with for a long time on this ban. EPA also banned trichloroethylene, or TCE, which is a chemical degreaser that causes cancer as well as fetal cardiac malformations, and was commonly used in both commercial and consumer settings. Perchloroethylene, or PCE, was also banned. That's also a degreaser, most commonly known for its use in dry cleaning. And there is now a ban on new uses of asbestos, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. And then the process for approving new chemicals became much more stringent as well. So, for example, before, pre-2016, hundreds of problematic PFAS were allowed onto the market, which has left us with really devastating PFAS contamination crisis across the country. But since the reforms, approvals have significantly dropped, stymieing the introduction of new PFAS onto the market. Next slide, please. All right, finally, I want to share some examples of chemicals at the intersection of TSCA and healthy homes. And there are many chemicals covered by TSCA that can be found in the home. You can see a number of them in the graphic to the right, as well as many more not pictured. But I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail on the 4 listed on the left side of the slide. So first, on asbestos, as I mentioned just a moment ago, in 2024, EPA banned ongoing uses of chrysotile asbestos, which is the only type that was still in use, primarily used in the chlor-alkali industry, and also banned its use in automotive brakes and linings, as well as a couple of other uses. Aside from this, EPA also has evaluated what it calls legacy uses of asbestos. So those are things like insulation in the home that are, probably more commonly thought of in the healthy homes community, as well as their disposal. And through this process, EPA found unreasonable risk. And so the next step should be for EPA to propose a regulation to mitigate that unreasonable risk under TSCA. Next, 1,4-dioxane is a carcinogen commonly found as a byproduct in cleaning products found in the home, such as laundry detergents and others. In addition to the direct exposure that one can experience from using that laundry detergent or whatever the cleaning product may be, down the drain releases also contaminates the water supply, which ultimately ends up back at our tap in our drinking water. So EPA also identified that 1,4-dioxane presents an unreasonable risk, and it's now slated for upcoming regulation under TSCA. Formaldehyde, which I know this group knows is very common in construction products like adhesives and pressed wood products, was also evaluated by TSCA in the previous administration, finding unreasonable risk. Unfortunately, in December, the current administration proposed to reopen the evaluation and weaken the science on formaldehyde, including by nearly doubling the amount of formaldehyde considered safe to breathe. So we're in a little bit of limbo here to see what will happen next. We can expect that any proposed regulation under TSCA under this administration likely would be much weaker than it would have been under the original scientific assessment. And then finally, lead and lead compounds have not been addressed under TSCA Title I yet. However, they are currently listed on what's called the TSCA Work Plan, which is essentially a short list of prioritized chemicals that will be up for review in the future. And one more important thing I want to note is that for both lead and formaldehyde, a decision on the toxicity under Title I could affect the standards for Title IV and Title VI, respectively. So this is something important to keep in mind, in particular in light of the fact that Congress is currently debating weakening Title I of TSCA. And that is it for me, Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. And hopefully all of you are already starting to draw those connections about why this is so relevant. And a lot of the advice we're in the business of giving people around, cleaning their homes, washing their bedding, replacing that flooring really matters, and how it intersects with this chemical policy. And I'd like to invite Robin Dodson, Associate Director of Research Operations and Senior Scientist with Silent Spring Institute, to share some information for us on that theme about how prevalent some of these chemicals are in the homes that many of us are already working in, and why it really isn't practical to just rely on individual choice alone. Robin, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Lindsay, for setting that up. My name is Robin Dodson, and I'm an exposure scientist at Silent Spring Institute. And what that means as an exposure scientist is that I try to think about and kind of get to play detective and trying to understand how we're exposed to chemicals of health concern in our everyday lives. And as you all know, right, spend most of that time indoors, particularly in our homes. And so that's where a lot of my research is focused, is thinking about home-based exposures to chemicals. Now, as we launch into thinking about indoor exposures, I really like this. It's getting a bit dated, but I really like this kind of conceptual framework that was introduced by my colleague Gary Adamkiewicz and others in a paper that's great. It's called Moving Environmental Justice Indoors. But what I really like about this conceptual framework is that it acknowledges that chemical exposures are a function not only of the sources inside of homes, so that includes things like cleaning products and furnishings, but is also a function of what's outdoors, so things that might get in, but then also a function of the physical structure of the home, the ventilation characteristics, and also things like the activity patterns. The people matter. The behaviors inside of the house can have an influence here. So all of this is to say is that it's not just one part of the, one piece of the puzzle here. We have to kind of bring it all together when we're really trying to understand what exposures might be. Now, keeping in mind, the reason they put this framework forward is because not all of these are unique equally prevalent depending on your housing. So, especially if we have poor conditions in some homes, or if you have occupant behaviors, all of those can lead to a credible amount of variability. Actually, we see and some exposures inside the house. So when I'm talking about contaminants of health concern, certainly we can think of what I would consider more kind of the traditional indoor environmental quality indicators. These are things like carbon monoxide, radon, lead paint, of course, VOCs, or volatile organic compounds. I spent a lot of time in my graduate work thinking about VOCs and where we're exposed, and particularly about how they might move through our indoor environments. Of course, there's things like formaldehyde and even non-chemical things like lighting or noise. But since I came to Silent Spring, now over 15 years ago, I also focus on a lot of other common pollutants inside the home because they also have been associated with health effects. These include things like phthalates, parabens, bisphenols, those plasticizers, UV filters, antimicrobials, flame retardants, those PFAS or forever chemicals, and even fragrance chemicals. Many of these other common pollutants are what are considered to be semi-volatile, which means that they can move throughout the home. They can readily partition. And these dynamics make it very interesting to try to study. It can mean that the good thing is that we can take measurements in kind of one compartment of the indoor environment and try to understand or predict based on physical chemical properties what it might be in other areas. It also provides different ways for me to measure these exposures inside of homes. So it could be anywhere from taking surface wipes like you might do with lead, for example, indoor air samples, or even collecting house dust. So we've employed all of these kind of measurement approaches in the many exposure studies that we've conducted here at Silent Spring Institute. We started back with the first household exposure study back in about 25 years ago now, that was really focused on looking at endocrine disrupting chemicals in homes, really measuring some of the majority of them actually for the first time in people's homes in the United States. And we looked in indoor air and dust and even collected urine samples. And we've kept going. We've gone into Northern California where we've conducted similar sampling. We've gone into low-income housing as part of some work that you'll hear a little bit in a couple slides from now, trying to understand about the role of the occupant. We've expanded that work to college campuses. We've expanded it to subsidized housing through the Green Housing Study in Boston, Cincinnati, and New Orleans. We've expanded it also to Rochester, New York, which I will talk about in just a few slides, looking at some of those co-exposures inside of homes. And then more recently have been spending a lot of time thinking about PFAS impacted communities. So have been doing some work here in Massachusetts looking at residential exposures to PFAS. So what are we finding as we're collecting all of these samples? This is actually a table that came from a meta-analysis that I was part of almost a decade ago now, where it was looking at many of these SVOCs in the literature as reported in household dust. And like you can see here, that phthalates, for example, are ubiquitous. In fact, every single sample I've ever collected, whether it be house dust or indoor air in people's homes, contain phthalates. Phthalates are common plasticizers. They're also found in personal care products. They make that fragrance in personal care products stick around a little bit longer, and they're highly prevalent. They're found in all of our homes. Also things like flame retardants that are intentionally added to things like upholstered furniture. Synthetic fragrances are also common, and even phenols or methylparaben, which is commonly found in actually personal care products. So these chemicals are quite prevalent inside of homes, and we've continued to see them in homes. This is, I alluded to, work that we are doing actually in Rochester, New York, where we're trying to evaluate all the other pollutants in people's homes. So this is what we're working with, is collaborating with the City of Rochester and the University of Rochester to actually collect samples in people's homes who are going through lead rehabilitation programming in that city. And we're bringing in those other contaminants of health concern, other contaminants like phthalates, like flame retardants, and pesticides, all of which, like lead, can harm the development of children, and so are important to look for. So what we're doing here in this study is that it's a longitudinal study. So we're collecting a whole bunch of samples, in this case, mostly in dust samples. And then they're going through the lead hazard control program. And then we take more samples after the programming. So what are we seeing? Well, surprise, surprise, I am finding phthalates in everybody's home. That is not at all of a surprise to me necessarily, although we're finding a lot of other stuff too. Nearly half of our homes had DDT. DDT, remember, was banned, thank you to Rachel Carson, over 50 years ago, and it's still found in people's homes. And you can see actually of the 42 chemicals that we looked for in the house dust samples, we're finding on average about 18. Some homes are more impacted or more burdened than others. And also want to draw your attention over to the right. What I'm showing here, the concentrations on a log scale. And what I really want to draw your attention to is the fact that these concentrations span orders of magnitude. And so it's one it's like a stepping point for me to kind of put on my detective hat and start asking questions about why. Why are some people have much higher levels of some of these contaminants inside their home compared to others? And that's where we can start coming up with ideas around what are maybe potential interventions that we could develop to help people reduce their exposures inside the home. If we can get those people that have the highest concentrations to look a little bit more like the people who have the lowest concentrations, then we can make some meaningful impact. So that variability or that kind of range over which we see these contaminants are not just found in house dust. In fact, indoor air can also see an incredible amount of variability in the concentrations that we see. So what I'm showing here are some data that are coming out of the Green Housing Study, which is a CDC study that was looking at subsidized housing with asthmatic children, and we brought in some resources to look at SVOCs inside of those homes. And really, you can see, for example, if you look at the very bottom there, phthalates, DEP, which is a diethyl phthalate. It's commonly found in things like fragrance products, not just fragrances like perfume. I mean, any kind of cleaning products or anything like that that might impart some sort of fragrance. You can see, again, orders of magnitude of those concentrations that we're observing inside these people's homes. So what are we going to do about it? Much of this work is spent time kind of characterizing what are the concentrations right now. We conducted a study a couple of years ago now that is part of some HUD funding that we had that was looking at trying to kind of disentangle what is there because it's because of the building versus what is there because of the occupant. So we call this the move-in study. And what we did is that we actually collected indoor air samples and wipes inside newly renovated subsidized housing in Boston. All of the units were renovated to the same specification. And then we went back over a month after occupancy to then collect some more samples. Now, besides the fact that that actually was from study design and from actually carrying it out, quite a tricky task to try to get into people's homes after saying, hey, we were here before, can we come back? That was tricky, but we got in and were able to actually really kind of characterize what those levels are once participants moved back in. Now, what's the point? The point is because if we're able to identify the chemicals by their source inside of these homes, we can start coming up with intervention strategies. So we were able to distinguish based on chemicals that were there and then maybe went down or kind of their levels didn't change with occupancy as chemicals that we would say are building related. So this includes things like phthalates. Phthalates can be used in building materials, they can be used in paints, they can be used in flooring. They include things like flame retardant chemicals, so which can be used in insulation and other when you're kind of rehabbing some of the walls, so around the electrical fixtures, things like that. Of course, VOCs are introduced with the building. The construction practices, things like toluene, xylene, and ethylbenzene. UV filter was introduced. That's actually one was surprising. I would have put this in the beforehand, would have put this in the occupant category, but this is there likely because it's used as a in paints as a kind of a stabilizer, as a UV stabilizer. And then, of course, other plasticizers like nonylphenol. Those all went into the building category. And then there are those chemicals that were introduced by the occupant, where the levels went up or only were found after occupancy. So this would be a different tactic. So where the building materials, we might talk to material specialists, we might talk to building contractors, we might talk to the certification programs about the presence of those chemicals. Whereas chemicals that would be introduced with the occupant, we might focus on occupant education. So this is helping us trying to figure out what the best strategies might be. So this includes things, of course, like VOCs, things like methylene chloride, things like perchloroethylene or tetrachloroethylene, acetaldehyde, all come in with the occupants. Flame retardants come in with the occupants. This actually, unfortunately, this was 10 years after many of these BDE flame retardants were phased out, but they were being brought in old furniture and old furnishings into the houses, into the units. Of course, the fragrances are no surprise. Many phthalates as well, and adipates are coming in. Things like nicotine, of course, ethylene alcohol, methylparaben, a preservative in personal care products, and triclosan, and antimicrobial. So this is our start in trying to think about intervention strategies, and really is kind of how we start kind of putting that everything together to try to understand what might be the most effective strategy to help support people to reduce their exposures indoors. So if it's building related, if it's occupant related, we can start developing those intervention strategies. Many of those intervention strategies I've been testing over the last couple of years. I'll share one example of an intervention strategy that was shown to be effective. This actually was an intervention that we did actually in classrooms at the Brown School of Public Health during COVID. So here we are on the left, it's Joe Braun and I led the study where Brown was going to install these Corsi Rosenthal boxes inside classrooms to mitigate the COVID risk. So we took a pre and a post indoor air measurements to try to see, well, what are the impacts on other things inside in the air? And what's really great is that we saw significant reductions in both phthalates and PFAS with the installation of these air filters inside classrooms. And so this is great. It's kind of a proof of concept that these air filters are having much more kind of bigger impact than first realized. And really we can kind of think about this not only from what institutions should do, but also what we might do in our own homes. So as I wrap up, I just want to really stress is that when we're designing intervention strategies, we're really needing to think about kind of a multiple level strategies here. That yes, there are things that consumers can do. There are choices they can make. They can make certain consumer choices. There are things that institutions can do through their product specifications, purchasing specifications. There are things that retailers can do. And of course, there are things at the regulatory or policy level. Not one of these will not work entirely to solve the problem of indoor exposures. Rather, we need to combine them together to really come up with the most effective solution. And really the solution that would be most kind of equitable across all different kind of populations is thinking about these at multiple levels and even trying to go up as far upstream as possible. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Robin. I feel like no matter how many times I hear you share your work, and I'm always looking around my home and questioning my own personal choices here, as well as thinking about implications for our practice in the field of healthy housing. Finally, I would like to welcome our last panelist, Suhani Chitalia, who is Senior Manager of Federal Affairs with EDF, who's going to help us understand where things stand right now with TSCA and what the future might hold. So, Suhani.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and a big thank you to Lindsay and Robin for laying so much groundwork around just the importance of both our chemicals law, but also understanding exposures from different places. And I just want to kind of touch on something that Robin mentioned, where she was talking about how there's chemicals both in kind of the structures of your homes, but also things that kind of we bring into our homes. And this is exactly why the Toxic Substances Control Act is so important. It touches on all of those chemicals, as long as it's not like your body products or your food. TSCA is the statute. It's kind of the gatekeeper for all of those chemicals that go into all of these different places, both in our homes and the actual structure and the materials that are built, but also the things that we utilize every day. So there's a lot kind of happening right now in the TSCA space. As Lindsay mentioned, there's a lot of history around it. But the kind of big turning point was in 2016 when a really massive reform happened to update the law and really allow the EPA to work to be able to protect public health and the environment. It has now been 10 years, and there has been a lot of back and forth in the administrations under which TSCA has been implemented. So it hasn't really had a chance to really fully be implemented to the full extent that it can be. It has a really good foundation, and there has been so much good work that has happened since 2016. But there still is a lot of space left for TSCA to really kind of like dig its teeth in and implement what the law intended it to. So right now there are two discussion drafts in its respective chambers in the House and the Senate. And these discussion drafts are coming up because over the past 10 years, there is kind of this recognition from industry that the TSCA is working. There are more requirements around chemical safety, more data is required, reviews take a little bit longer, and this hurts industry's bottom line very, very often. And you know, it's a new regulatory regime that they have not been used to for a really long time when it comes to their chemical reviews. So over the past 10 years, I think as they've kind of like understood what the statute does, they have pushed on the hill that, oh, this is going too far. The reviews are taking too long. But the actuality is that the statute is working. It is protecting public health. EPA is using its authority to understand the risks associated with chemicals prior to them entering the market. And this year is in particular very pivotal because at the end of September, something called EPA's fee authority expires. And what this does is it provides critical funding for the agency to be able to kind of allow function for its new chemicals program. So when companies submit a chemical for review, they have to pay a fee, and that fee goes towards the office that looks at these reviews. And it's a really, really critical piece of funding. It expires at the end of September, and now industry is kind of using this fee expiration as a Trojan horse to open the door and look at TSCA again. It's important to know that right now this is very much an industry-led push. Back in 2016, as Lindsay had mentioned, this was a incredibly massive bipartisan effort. We had ENGOs, health groups, different advocacy organizations, labor, the chemical industry, Democrats, Republicans, all come together as this recognition that our chemical safety law was not working to protect our public. Now it's only the industry kind of knocking on doors. They want to water down many of these really important and hard-fought standards. And the health groups, the environmental groups, and many other organizations are trying to hold TSCA strong. We're trying to make sure that, you know, this law continues to work in the way that it's intended to. And we want to make sure that all of its provisions kind of remain so they're able to kind of go into fruition in the way Congress intended them to. So where are these discussion drafts currently in the House and Senate? That the House had introduced a discussion draft back in January of 2026, and the Senate subsequently introduced a discussion draft in late February of 2026. So they're kind of back to back. Discussion drafts are kind of like a wonky term. It's not a formal piece of legislation just yet. They're kind of like working documents. They don't have a formal sponsor or co-sponsor to them, and they're kind of more workable documents. We're still awaiting formal introduction. Our understanding is both of these discussion drafts are kind of back in their homes of where they were introduced, which was from leadership in the respective committees in both the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Environment and Public Works Committee in the Senate, to try and rework some of the language. Both of these discussion drafts have had hearings that happened a couple of weeks after their introduction, and they kind of talk through a lot of the points that they had in the discussion draft. And I'm going to go into the discussion drafts and kind of what they did later. But at this point, I think there was a recognition that there wasn't a lot of agreement around these discussion drafts, so which is why they're kind of back to the drawing board. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so the House discussion draft was the first one that was introduced. It came out on January 15th, and the House draft was a very, very sweeping reform that they're proposing. It cuts across 9 different sections of the Toxic Substances Control Act, and it significantly weakens many critical standards that were hard fought in 2016. Namely, it would weaken that affirmative determination standard where currently the EPA is required to make an affirmative determination that a chemical does not pose an unreasonable risk to human health or in the environment. It would water down that standard, and it kind of no longer has that safety benchmark prior to a chemical entering the market. It also increases it raises the bar for what EPA has to prove in order to show that a chemical has any harms or risks associated with it. So for example, if the EPA initially had to show that A, B, and C were required to show that there was a risk associated with the chemical, now EPA would have to prove A through Z. So it significantly kind of raises what EPA has to prove in order for them to regulate a chemical. And what this would allow is many additional chemicals to enter the market, because it really makes it difficult for EPA to be able to show that a chemical is riskier or has hazards around it. But ultimately, this really undermines EPA's ability to protect people, and it limits the ability for EPA to have companies test their chemicals or provide data around chemicals. A big part of this discussion draft is really limiting the data that EPA can utilize when they're making determinations for chemicals. So not only does EPA now have to prove more, they also have less information to be able to prove it. So I always say that this discussion draft is almost like asking EPA to tie their hands, and then we're asking them to swim. Just as a very kind of sweeping overview of the House discussion draft. I know Lindsay talked about many of the different sections of TSCA, but this significantly undermines Section 6 of TSCA, which is the existing chemicals program. It also significantly undermines Section 5, which is a program that looks at new chemicals prior to them entering the market. And it also undermines Section 4, which is the testing of chemicals. Again, like I said, this touches 9 different sections of TSCA, but these are some of the biggest bedrock changes that happened out of 2016 that are under probably the most significant attack. If we can go to the next slide. And this is just kind of touching on some stuff that I already mentioned, but there's a link here that will go to the Energy and Commerce subcommittee hearing that happened back in January. I think it was about a week after that discussion draft language was introduced. But one theme that has consistently come up as we talk about TSCA, or not we, but rather industry kind of talks about when they bring up TSCA, is that it's not efficient and we're not getting innovative chemicals onto the market. And this is a very common kind of narrative that is being used, all in the guise to kind of expedite companies' own chemicals to get across the finish line quicker. But what's often kind of left unsaid is the reason for why these chemicals are delayed in the process. And a part of that is because a lot of information that industry is required to provide EPA is not provided during that first round when they're trying to determine the safety around a chemical. EPA then has to go back to the industry and say, hey, we see that you have this chemical, but you need like a ton of PPE. There's severe limitations on how you can use this, and there's significant guardrails that will limit your production and use of this chemical. The company obviously doesn't like that because PPE is an additional expense. They want to be able to use the chemical more freely. So they gather more data and they go back to EPA and say, oh, hey, like we just have a bunch of new data that we put together. Here's a second set of data. And then EPA kind of like relooks at the data, and there's kind of this negotiation process that now happens between the EPA and the industry. We kind of frame it as it's almost like a student getting a D on a paper and going back to their teacher to redo an assignment until they can get an A. This is an incredibly inefficient process, and that's partially why so many of these chemicals are being held up so often in OCSPP and within EPA. We have a number of resources that are also linked here. We have a bill analysis that kind of runs through some of our major points on the House discussion draft, as well as a blog series that really kind of dives into the House proposal. And sorry, I recognize I'm running out of time, so I'll just quickly touch on the Senate version. So if we can just go to the next slide. I'll be pretty quick on this. The Senate discussion draft does many of the same things, but there is just a particular focus on the new chemicals program. It rolls back that affirmative safety determination, similar to what the House discussion draft does, but it also creates this like new tiering system that could allow chemicals onto the market without adequate review. And a lot of like the issues that kind of come up in this tiering system is that they kind of undergo like a comparative risk analysis. So if a chemical is marginally safer than one that is already on the market, it could be tiered higher for it to be reviewed quicker. So it theoretically could be the safer alternative to what's already on the market. The issue here is one, like marginally safer does not mean safe. If there's a chemical that's already out there in the market that, let's say, has like a 50% cancer risk, just because this new chemical has a 45% cancer risk does not mean that it should end up on the market. I think that there's like this common misconception that just because a chemical is safer, it should be prioritized in entering the market. The other part of that is that the old chemical does not leave the market. There's no provision right now that requires a company to take an older chemical off the market if a new or better one enters the market. So the tiering system kind of creates a whole host of problems, but a big one is just that it would allow many new chemicals without adequate review. There's also many exemptions and loopholes for really dangerous chemicals, including chemicals that are through plastic burning or pyrolysis. Those have really, really high cancer risks. So having that massive loophole could be very, very problematic. And then you'll see this bullet on return of the shot clock. And this takes us back to a standard that was like prior to 2016. Essentially, Lindsay mentioned this, like what happens is what happened prior to the 2016 reform is that a lot of chemicals, if there wasn't enough information, there's kind of that no data, no problem. They were just approved within 90 days if there wasn't adequate data to show otherwise. This is kind of returning that same idea where if EPA can't prove the risks around a chemical within 90 days, they would essentially automatically enter the market. And then kind of riddled throughout both of these discussion drafts is heavy industry influence in science and self-selection for peer review of the data that they provide when EPA makes a determination for a chemical. I think those are like the big points for the Senate discussion draft, and I'm happy to answer questions later if folks have them. If we could just go to the next slide. And these are just some more resources on the Senate draft. We have a bill analysis that kind of touches on an overview, and then this is also a link to the hearing for the discussion draft back in March. And sorry, I think we might be on the last slide. So EDF has been doing a lot of work in the TSCA space. We had a congressional briefing just a couple weeks ago that brought in community voices to discuss how chemical exposures impact their lives. We had labor, nurse, we had a community member who had lost her daughter to TCE exposure. And it kind of connected that these chemical exposures matter and they have an impact on people every day. This isn't just some some statute that exists that doesn't actually like impact folks' everyday lives. We're surrounded by things that go through TSCA. All of our products around us have chemicals in it that have had to go through TSCA. So it is a very, very personal statute. And coming up, we also have a lobby day and a press event, and we're doing radio tours in multiple markets to also elevate and raise community voices. So this is my very quick run through. I know that I'm very over time, but if folks have questions around any of the congressional facing work, I'm more than happy to answer them. Thank you. And I'm so sorry for eating up a little bit of extra time.
No apologies needed. Thank you so much, Suhani. That was a really, really helpful overview for a very complex topic. And we appreciate everything EDF is doing. Thank you also to our entire panel for setting the stage for an important conversation that we hope is just getting started today. And with that, I'm going to invite the whole panel to join us here. All of you spotlighted here. And with the time we have left, I want to start by just asking us to really, really connect the dots for all of our attendees here and really help underscore the implications for healthy housing practice here. So maybe you can help us sort of understand how you see these connections, maybe through the lens of either existing or past interventions that we've used as a field that maybe led to some regrettable choices. We were getting rid of one hazard, but unintentionally through our flooring choice or cleaning product choice or something else bringing, a new exposure in, or maybe there are some specific chemicals or exposure pathways that you feel like are underappreciated for this healthy housing field that you'd really like us to, wake up and pay attention to. So yeah, could you, anybody can start here. I would love to hear if you could help us connect those dots a little more forcefully.
Sure, I can jump in, I guess. So yeah, I do want to stress one thing I didn't get a chance to kind of get into, but some of that Rochester work where we're looking longitudinally at kind of over time at levels inside the house. I didn't share kind of some of those findings yet because they are still kind of forthcoming and preliminary. But we are seeing, unfortunately, and even it fits with our original hypothesis, is that phthalates, for example, which we know are used in building materials, they're used in resilient flooring, they're used in paints. We kind of were like, we don't know, right? Like it could be that the lead hazard or the lead rehabilitation work could actually draw down those exposures because of intensive cleaning or other kind of changes inside the home. But it's also possible, unfortunately, that they could be introduced. Luxury vinyl flooring is very popular. It's a, resilient flooring choice in many of these programs. And so it unfortunately is looking like we might be seeing some kinds of phthalates, some phthalates actually going up with some of this work. So that's an example of where if we kind of, put the spotlight on maybe one thing at a time, we're losing kind of what's happening in the background, certainly.
I can add to that. Just, I think this is a challenge. The regrettable substitutions problem is just something that we grapple with all the time, right? And I think there's a lot of opportunity within the TSCA statute and other regulation to sort of get at this problem. I think one sort of classic example that comes up a lot is in the PFAS space, right? There was, PFOA and some of the really nasty chemicals that we knew we needed to get off the market. And so companies started to produce new types of PFAS, right? And Gen X is an example of a chemical that was thought to be safer than what was already out on the market. It was actually produced initially as a byproduct that went through the TSCA New Chemicals program, before it was reformed. And now we have a massive amount of problems and contamination from that chemical, right? And so looking at these chemicals holistically is so important. And one of the things that TSCA does have the ability to do is look at classes of chemicals or groups of chemicals and to consider some of those trade-offs. So it's a great point. There's countless examples of going from BPA to BPF and whatnot. So, but I won't list them all off for you.
And just to add to that, one big change that they're proposing in both of these discussion drafts is no longer considering susceptible populations. And this includes fence line communities or just communities that live near these polluting facilities. So that is a massive change from what was proposed in 2016. And we do know that a lot of these polluting facilities are not just polluting one chemical, but multiple chemicals. So we're talking about not just one exposure, but a number of exposures that could happen to fence line communities and what they'd be exposed to. And another point is just that TSCA is a cradle to grave statute. It considers the chemical from its manufacturing point to its disposal point. So it's important to note that this isn't just when chemicals are both produced, but it's also when it's under your kitchen sink and you're kind of spraying your cleaner bottle to when you dispose it and it ends up in a landfill near your community as well. So it's really prevalent kind of in our everyday lives in many, many different ways.
Thank you all. I think those are great messages of thinking about classes of chemicals, thinking about interactions between and looking at the exposure more holistically and thinking about the life cycle of these products in our home. That's great. We have another couple of questions that have come in here, including, are there easy ways to scan or look for these kind of chemicals in a product when you're choosing things or within a home? Does this require lab testing? I think we've gotten questions here, both on an individual level. I think people are probably like I am looking around my own home, but also on a practitioner level, right? Are there frameworks, if folks are listening through a healthy housing practitioner lens, are there frameworks that might help guide their purchasing or procurement decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in here. A lot of my work too is focused on consumer products and personal care products, and that is a totally different space when it comes to labeling of ingredients as compared to building materials, which do not have some comprehensive labeling requirements. So it's a really tricky situation, and unfortunately, it requires a lot of us to kind of stick on our chemist hat and really try to dig into this and try to understand what's going on. And give an anecdote is that we were trying to pick out a PFAS-free paint for an office space, and it was incredibly difficult. And we are a bunch of chemists, and so that is just a testament to the fact of we shouldn't put all of this on the consumer to the point of or the purchasing point, but actually let's throw that way back upstream and make that a lot easier by actually regulating. And that's not only because we shouldn't all have to put on our chemistry hats, but it's also think about I might be privileged and have the resources to be able to do that, but there are many people who don't. And the more kind of equitable solution would be to actually regulate those way upstream. Yeah.
Thanks, Robin. I also, Lindsay, go ahead, jump in here.
Sorry, I know we're running low on time, so
right.
I won't talk too long. But that's a fantastic point, Robin. I just we always kind of say you can't shop your way out of the problem. It is incredibly difficult. I could tell you so many anecdotes about my experience as a mother trying to shop my way out of the problem, and it is truly impossible. That said, we can maybe send around some of the resources that do exist, things like Safer Choice labeling from EPA for cleaning products and car-based products. Habitable has a really fantastic resource for building materials and some other product sources. Green Guard is another one for things like mattresses and furniture. So things do exist. There's a recognition that there's a gap, but it's very challenging, and so that's why we really do focus on regulatory fixes where we can.
Thank you. And I will add here, I'm going to ask all of you in a minute, just say to close briefly with what is one mindset shift that you would hope that people are taking as we're leaving this webinar, knowing that our audience is mostly healthy housing practitioners. We've gotten a lot of questions in the chat also about all the resources that have been mentioned and that are being shared, some requests about how people can get involved with advocacy around TSCA. So I am going just to offer that we will follow up with all of the resources that have been shared to anybody who registered for this webinar. We'll follow up with a complete list, as well as more information about other ways that you can get involved in some of the advocacy work that Suhani mentioned. We also know our colleagues at the Environmental Law Institute. If you just this whet your appetite, you want to know a lot more, they're hosting a look back at the last 10 years of TSCA reform next month in partnership with George Washington University and some others. We'll provide all of that information to all of you as a follow-up so that you can continue to learn. We can continue to learn together. Obviously, we should have budgeted more time for such a complex topic, but I'd like just to take the last minute here to invite all of you to briefly reflect on what is one mindset shift you hope that any of us, me, any of the people listening, are taking from our conversation today as we think about our healthy housing practice.
Sure. I mean, I would say that I think source control is the most effective way with dealing with these exposures inside of homes. If anything, the fact that I can still detect DDT 50 years later in people's homes, and PFAS is even more persistent than DDT, this problem will not go away. You cannot, try to mitigate your way out of these problems once it's inside the house. So we need to deal with source control, and we need to get these out of materials that people are bringing into their homes.
Lindsay?
Maybe I can say two things real quick. One is that I've also been in the lead and drinking water space for over a decade. And so I also wear that hat, and I know how easy it is to be sort of laser focused in on a specific chemical and specific exposure. And so I think one just overarching thing is just like the challenge of looking at this all holistically and bringing it all together it's so important. The other is, we know that any good public health prevention, when it's working, you don't notice it. And I think in a lot of ways, the new chemicals program has really been working to stop these really nasty chemicals from coming onto the market. And I don't want to see a world in which, we see it because it's no longer working. So I'll pass it to Suhani.
I have a very, very high message and like a very, very overarching message. I'm from Baltimore City, and we have a saying when we talk about our policies that Baltimore deserves the best and nothing less. And I think that that's true for everyone. I think our families, our communities, and ourselves, we deserve the best and nothing less. And that is why we have a chemical safety law. We shouldn't have to pick up a product off a shelf and worry about it. And that's why this is so important. We do deserve the best.
Thank you for that, Suhani. And thank you to all of you for being the best partners, for coming to share this expertise, for helping us in the healthy housing field to sort of widen our perspective and understand this intersection a little bit better. Thank you to all of you who joined today to come and learn more about this. We hope that, as we said, this is just the start of a conversation. We'll be following up with those resources and hopefully a lot more action to come. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.